Thanks so much for joining the Quillette podcast.
No, thanks for having me on, Jonathan. It's good to be back.
So, one thing that I think will interest readers is you have a lengthy section in your book, which is obviously it's about communism. But you start off by talking about the ideas that preceded communism, that influenced it, and in a way that I think will provoke thought, because you linger a little bit on some of the, I don't know if ideological is the right word because we're talking about a religion, the connections between Christianity and communism,
Hmm.
the idea of sharing, the idea of a better world, the idea of accumulating riches in, I guess, what we would now call a capitalist class as being kind of morally suspect. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the broad links between the development of Christian thought and the eventual, I mean, we're talking about centuries,
Right.
evolution of something that starting in the 19th century started to become communism?
Well, sure. No, I mean, I do linger on it a bit because I think it's important. I mean, it maybe makes some people uncomfortable to think there's any connection between
I
Christianity
wasn't
and
uncomfortable.
yeah. I mean, some people might if they view communism as kind of this atheistic new morality meant to supplant Christianity, and eventually you did get these regimes that were aggressively atheistic. I mean, they would actually go in and even try to disprove the existence of relics and that sort of thing. But I think you can obviously see there's a common root. Notions of in the broadest sense, social equality, but that is to say, the equality of all believers, the equality of all souls. Christianity, one of the real innovations in a way in which people used to talk about Athens and Jerusalem, that a lot of our inheritance comes from the Greco Roman world and mythology and ideas about politics. And that's true, of course, ideas about democracy, republican governance, and so on. But in a lot of ways, that was still a very elite comfortable world. That is to say, there was always this notion that certain people had more value than others, or maybe they were greater than others, they were more heroic or stronger, obviously richer in many cases. The Greco-Roman world was very comfortable with slavery, for example. Obviously, the whole society really couldn't have existed without it. In fact, there's almost a notion that you can't really have citizens without slaves. I mean, it's part of the definition of who the citizens are, who the freeborn are versus the slaves. Whereas Christianity, of course, famously was even denounced by Nietzsche. I don't talk about Nietzsche in the book just because I don't think he's an important antecedent for communism, but it's a related idea, seeing it as almost a slave religion, that is a religion of the weak, of the meek, of the oppressed. And then you get to this tradition, which I talk a little more about material renunciation, the idea that the true Christian must not seek worldly riches, or if they happen to attain them, they should renounce them, share them. The idea of dying in rags and poverty is this the idea of charity and sharing out the wealth. This is obviously an important part of the tradition that will, in some strands, I think, eventually lead to more radical ideas about social equality. I mean, one way of putting it is that communism and, well, Marxism, from which communism derives, is a kind of heresy. You might say it's taking Christianity in a new direction, because Marx himself
Yeah.
obviously explicitly criticized Christianity, and to some extent he took a Hegelian strand of philosophy about history, and he just kind of emptied it of the Christian content. But he obviously was getting the ideas from somewhere. So the ideas about, whether it was the idea about social progress or the idea about material renunciation, and there being almost a sin, really, in
Yeah.
being greedy or wealthy. He obviously takes it in a different direction, but I think he's clearly drawn on that broader tradition. It's almost impossible to imagine Marxism from the eschatology, the idea of a final judgment. Some of it is also just the way thought progresses in the Christian, you could
Actually,
say Judeo-Christian, but more explicitly Christian tradition, right, towards a final judgment for mankind.
well, so I wanted to emphasize that because this is an aspect I hadn't thought of, the idea of history moving forward in a particular direction.
Hmm.
Because you make the point that we take it for granted that a lot of systems of thought that are dominant in our society imagine societies improving,
Hmm.
whether it's the progressive tradition making society more fair, or technological utopianism. But that for the majority of history, in most systems of thought, history was largely thought of as cyclical. There
Hmm.
are seasons. The gods had their seasons, and the world would be reborn, but not in any kind of like way that was moving forward to some kind of, call it a utopia, or in Christianity, there's sort of like a final judgment or a new Jerusalem. But Marxism, communism, is very much about a linear, progressive, stage-wise progression of humanity. And you're saying there are links between that and the broad tradition of the Christian
No, I
thought
think
experience.
that's right. It's not just that other cultures in Asia and India and China and Buddhism have a different notion, sense of time. Cyclical might be one way of
Which,
describing it,
which,
but
by the way, makes sense in eras of human history when the pace of technological development was
right,
extremely low. So you lived in your grandfather's world. So it kind of made
right.
sense to see life as
Yeah,
cyclical.
some things might have gotten better, some things might have gotten worse.
Yeah.
There was a time, a cycle, like you say, for all seasons. But you could even see this in the Western world before the advent of Christianity. You could see it, for example, in traditions of thought about democracy and republicanism. You look at
Mm.
Greece, and there's all this. Well, you have democracies, and they lead to tyrannies, and then maybe they lead back to something like oligarchy or maybe monarchy. And Aristotle's talking about all the different forms of government. It's not like there's progress exactly. It's more like sometimes you have better periods of governance and sometimes worse. And then eventually under the Romans, you even get this cycle and this kind of famous trope about the Republic, its death agonies producing in the end an empire. And so here you
Right.
have that's not progress exactly. It's kind of, well, you have one thing and then you have another. Whereas in Christianity, the idea is that not just that our lives have this kind of moral momentum, but that mankind as a whole is looking forward with millenarianism and these other ideas that there's this final judgment that awaits us all. There's a little bit of this in Islam and a little bit of this in Judaism, but it's particularly strong in Christianity, eschatology that it's sometimes called. And I think you can see this almost more clearly than the ideas about equality, for example, in a lot of Marx's writing. This idea of this kind of thunderous progression of history towards this final cataclysmic judgment. You can see it in Hegel in a slightly different way. Maybe it's not quite as violent and extreme, but Hegel's drawing on the Christian tradition as well and seeing, well, look, history is working its way out, and there it's a little friendlier to Christianity as a kind of a superior system of belief and religion and morality that eventually had produced real social progress and better lives for people and more respect for the poor and for those who were less fortunate. And Hegel mixes together with ideas about the secular quasi-national modern state that protected people and protected their civil rights. And we have laws and all the rest of it, that there was a kind of progress that was working itself out. So Marx took those ideas, some from Christianity, some from Hegel's reading of Christianity, and he just moved them in a slightly more violent direction by kind of adding the socialist elements, the idea about class and class struggle. But the belief system is quite similar. It's very eschatological. There's this very clear linear momentum towards a kind of final moment of judgment. And eventually he works this out in Das Kapital with the idea of the integument of private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated, this kind of thundering decision moment when I guess communism is supposed to be
Hmm.
ushered forth in the world. But you can very clearly tell kind of where that tradition comes from. It doesn't come from certainly doesn't come from Buddhism. It doesn't come from Islam.
But there's a certain messianic quality to it. And you see it maybe in some of the language of the
Mhm.
appointed vanguard, this idea
Right.
there's this intellectually rarefied class of people who see history for its purportedly scientific character and accelerate that migration toward like this more exalted state of humanity. So it kind of goes to the this is we're dealing with loose metaphors here, this sort of self-appointed priestly class
Right.
who sees beyond the shadows projected on the wall, right? Who sees the
Mhm.
movement of history, and even if the broad public, the proletariat on whose behalf this revolution is happening, even if they don't understand it, that's okay because the vanguard can read Latin and they can read Marxist
Right.
scripture and
Yeah,
they can tell them
they're
what.
prophets. They're prophets
Yeah.
in that sense, right? They see further than the others, and some of Marx's earliest critics. I mean, I single out Bakunin in particular as
Yes.
the
We're
anarchist.
going to put a placeholder into that because I want to talk about anarchism.
Oh well, no, great. It's just he
Yeah.
sees this and he
Yeah.
sees where it's going, and he says like this is to some extent a fundamental violation of
Well,
your
you
idea
call it his
of
prophecy.
equality.
Was
Yeah,
it the Bakunin prophecy? I think one of your
right. No, in,
chapters
in
is that.
his
Yeah.
case, I guess I'm paying him the compliment of saying
Yeah.
he's the prophet, but he sees where these would-be prophets are going. That is, they see themselves as this kind of elite priestly class who see further than the others. This new class they might have formerly been proletarians, or more likely they're probably intellectuals like Marx, and they will become tyrants greater than the world has
It
ever
was
seen.
something to the effect of like, well, the dictatorship of the proletariat will be all dictatorship and no proletariat, or
That's right. Right.
so, so yeah,
Kind of a dictatorship over the ruins.
yeah,
That is,
yeah, yeah,
you just have this elite class of oppressors.
yeah.
In some ways, the most authoritarian the world has ever seen, because they're presuming to direct everything, the
People like
entire
Lenin,
economy,
like
the entire.
self-selected.
Yeah,
Well, yeah,
yeah, it's just I call him a prophet in some ways, because I think you had to be kind of almost inside the movement to really understand it on its own terms and its rhythms and where it was going. And he had dealt with Marx personally. He also had read Marx's writings, but he kind of saw where this was going. That, in the end, you're going to get this new priestly class of
yeah.
intellectual oppressors. Who will exercise this tyranny greater than any before seen. And so he kind of saw it coming, and I think he saw it for good reason, because he was such a great student of Marx, and he actually had to interact with Marx in the history of
Yeah.
the first International Working Men's Association.
But
They vied for power.
to be a fly on the wall in that room, eh?
Yeah, yeah. Although
Yeah,
I don't know how many times I actually met personally. I mean, a lot of this was done through correspondence, of course, but they obviously had a rift that was pretty extreme. And it's interesting, you see an echo of that even earlier on. You saw it with Proudhon, sometimes called
right.
Father Anarchist. The anarchists were the first to kind of suss out where Marxism was going, because they had the suspicion of all constituted authority, including the one that Marx wanted to constitute on the ruins of the old.
And we're going down a rabbit hole here with the anarchists, but when you read the history of the Russian Revolution, um, the communists kind of stole ideas that were popular from the anarchists. Like the anarchists
Mhm.
were here we're getting into the weeds of like the SRs and the left SRs and like,
Right.
but amid the intra left wing foment of the 1910s and 1920s, when all this was sorting themselves out, the anarchists had the better of it in terms of what normal citizens actually wanted in terms of land back, and they didn't have a lot of patience for sort of maybe the more rarefied uh, theories that Marx and Lenin had spun.
Yeah,
And
anarchists also, I mean, sometimes called populists. That is,
mm,
those who had this program of the consumption labor standard, the idea that the land should return to the peasants, who should determine who should have how much land based on their need, and this sort of idea. And the Bolsheviks were perfectly willing to just copy and steal that idea for
yeah,
the
which
time
they
being,
did. Yeah,
which they did, even though
yeah,
they later abandoned it. I mean, that was part of the peace, land, bread trinity,
mm,
although they later, of course, abandoned it. But yeah, anarchists as well. I mean, particularly with the story of Kronstadt, this famous
yeah.
rebellion against Bolshevism that erupts in early 1921. Many of these people were militants who initially just saw the Bolsheviks as militants against oppression, and so they were willing to fight for them, and they didn't realize that eventually the Bolsheviks would be even more oppressive than the previous government had been. But yeah, they were perfectly willing to work with these people, to use them, to exploit them. But there was a kind of ruthlessness there in the way that they would then cast them aside when they were no longer needed.
Well, the
And they were
sailors, the sailors of Kronstadt, who'd been heroes of the communist revolution, maybe people listening to this might not be familiar with their story, but they probably are familiar with the fate of Boxer from Animal Farm. And to my mind, that's kind of the same thing, right? Where you've got
right.
these the people who do the bloody toil of actually fomenting revolution, and then get thrown under the wheels of history.
Yeah.
Um, Actually, I want to get back to the Christian roots of this because I think it's so interesting. Um, People who read the Quillette website will know that a couple of weeks ago I published a review of a new history of the German peasant revolt of
Ah,
1524, 1525, which was, people don't know a lot about it, but I think it's wrong to call it like a proto-communist revolution. But when you look at what some of these heretics, as they were denounced, these sort of like peasant folk preachers,
mm,
who rose up, like one of the first things they said was this feudal system is garbage. It
mm,
makes a mockery of Christ's teachings. They were particularly angry with the monasteries, which were got these sort
mm,
of like essentially the capitalists of the time. They brewed beer and they had local
sure.
monopolies, and it wasn't just a bunch of monks praying. They operated businesses. They were very exercised about fish ponds, which the locals couldn't fish in, which sounds ridiculous, but like that could be
Important.
life and
Sure.
death if you're feeding a family. And if you look at some of these folks, like first thing they said, get rid of the monasteries, get rid of the bishops, get rid of the priests, let us read the Bible for ourselves in our own language, down with hierarchies. Let us keep the food that we produce instead of sending it all off in tithes and all these like ancient medieval taxes and forfeitures. And every time someone had a kid or got married, they had to give away part of their estate to the local lord.
Hmm.
Um, it's actually quite shocking that, as you said, at least um, in the Soviet version, that Marx, well, this is predates the Soviet Union, of course, but Marx just said this is the opiate of the masses. It's a
Hmm.
false messiah. Is that just because people can only deal with one God, and your God has to be either communism or Christianity, and they're just the way the human mind works is there can only be one source of morality in the way our simplistic brains are organized?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, going back to the German peasant rebellion, you're right. Whether or not they were proto-communists, they're obviously drawing on this message of Christianity, this
They were
popular,
explicitly theological. Like
right?
it's not like they were
Theological, just the
rebelling.
idea that
Yeah,
these are all violations of Christ's teaching, the corruption, the taxation, the inequality, just the grotesque wealth of the church. I mean, Luther himself, of course, though distancing himself from the radicals,
oh, he hated
had
them.
already, right? He
And by
hated
the
them,
way, and the peasants weren't that interested in indulgences because
right?
they couldn't afford
I couldn't
indulgences.
afford them,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
No, it's in that way. Luther's, I'm not going to say a false prophet, but that is to say, his rebellion obviously is kind of curtailed, and he
He's an
does maybe in
elitist.
some ways take it to its logical
He was
conclusion.
a rebellion of the elites.
Right, in a rebellion of
Yeah,
the elites, and he did not want to take it to the next level.
yeah.
Whereas, in many ways, you could say it's very Christian, the things that they're both objecting to and that they're trying to stand on. All these things that are kind of violating Christ's teaching and the spirit and the essence of Christianity. You're right, though, about both Marx and then later Lenin. Why is it that they are in some ways so violently opposed to Christianity, whereas a lot of their ideas are kind of drawn from that tradition. Maybe it's that they don't want to admit that their ideas are drawn from that. It's they're trying almost too hard to distance themselves because they don't want to be just another voice in the
A
wilderness, kind
sect,
of a
another
Christian,
sect. Yeah,
another sect of Christianity. They want to have a new, I guess, faith, a new religion. And you're right. In that religion, there isn't room for the old relics. I mean, eventually, of course, they produced new relics. They replaced all
sure.
the Christian holidays with their own holy days, which would be everything from celebrating the February Revolution to the Paris Commune, obviously the
Or
October Revolution,
the people
May
lining
Day,
up to people lining up to see the corpse of Stalin,
right?
and or what we've seen in North Korea, which looks a lot like a religious cult when it comes to the Kim
Yeah.
dynasty.
Yeah, it's a replacement faith. And so Christianity was then a threat because, of course, a lot of the people still believed in Christianity, particularly the peasants. And that's part of the reason why the peasant wars became so violent. And oftentimes they were literally fought out in churches. Some of it was because the regime was trying to seize wealth, gold, silver, etc., from the churches. But some of it was also that they saw the peasants still had this loyalty to the old
Yeah.
faith, and they can't tolerate that because they want their loyalty to the new government. And so you had this. Some of the war with the peasants was over the food supply, but some of it was also about matters of faith, matters of religion. They tried, and you saw this in the French Revolution as well. I didn't talk a lot about this in the book, but both with the civil constitution of the clergy and the nationalization of the church property, the Bolsheviks take this, of course, to an even more extreme degree. But in the end, it was ultimately about loyalty. The French revolutionaries wanted all of the clerics of the church to be loyal to the new state, not to Rome. In the case of the Bolsheviks, eventually they realized they had to make some sort of modus vivendi with the church, but obviously they had to make sure that the key figures in the church, renovationists, they had other kind of names for them, basically we might call them toadies, the ones who were willing to just toe the
Yeah.
line and go along with the government. And they had to purge and shoot a lot of bishops. I mean, they did. You're talking low four figures. It's not maybe genocide on the scale of kind of
The
the Holy
kulaks are
War or the Mao's Great Leap Forward, but it's a significant number. I mean, they literally did shoot a lot of them because they saw them as rivals for the faith and the loyalty and obedience of the people.
which the French revolutionaries did I think it was in the Vendée where they
Yeah,
it was called revolutionary weddings, where they'd tie a priest and a woman together and throw them in the river. And in his this is a tangent, but in his last days, Robespierre essentially declared himself to be the prophet of a new religion.
right. I mean, the
Yeah,
Festival of the Supreme Being.
yeah,
with Robespierre. It
Yeah.
was in part because Robespierre thought the atheism had kind of gone too far, the war on the church had gone too far. But on the other hand, he didn't want to let the church back in the saddle, and so he said we need a new religion, a new state religion.
Yeah.
And in the end, it didn't quite come off. I mean, Robespierre
No,
obviously one of
well,
the
his
people
head came
who's
off is what happened.
yeah, his head came off, right? I mean,
For,
he had apparently convinced everyone that he himself was now this dangerous would be messianic
he
tyrant.
was, yeah, he was the Lenin. He was the Lenin of the French Revolution.
Right,
Which I mean, in this way, communism isn't special. It attracts sociopathic figures who see the revolutionary language as a conduit to complete power.
right,
And there's this laugh line. Well, it was not originally a laugh line, but when they say true communism has never been attempted,
sure.
it's always. Um, I mean, is that big picture question? Is that one of the problems with any totalizing creed? Is that it's flypaper for people who are just they have authoritarian tendencies, and they just
Hmm.
immediately recognize that
Yeah.
if you control this rhetoric, you can have absolute power. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
Lenin
a
seems,
license to steal and rob and do so with this kind of righteous fury that you believe you're carrying out some quasi divine mission to make the world a better place. But what you're actually doing, of course, is kind of robbing and stealing and in some cases raping and just kind of desecrating what a lot of people find holy. But it's justified, right? Because you do have this belief. And again, maybe some people had it more, some of the sadists attracted to it might not really have cared that much about the faith or the ideas. They just enjoyed the violence. It basically gave them the right to commit. But with you talking about the Robespierres and the Lenins of the world and the Maos of the world, I mean, absolutely, I think they come to embrace this mission, and they see it as all encompassing, and they see it as absolutely. It's not just the ends justifying the means, but that they're actually doing something sacred in putting class enemies to death, because this is actually an essential part of the faith. Class enemies, enemies of the states, immigrants, rebels. A lot of the language is already there in Marx, although we never really had the chance to put it into practice. A lot of the language is already there about expropriation, and you can see elements of that in Rousseau already with the social contract, the idea of people
yeah,
outside the political community maybe forfeiting their rights. But of course, with Marxism and then communism, it's not just about some ideal
I
Republican community and you put yourself outside of it. It's now literally you could be inside the community, but you're a class enemy or
right.
you're a tool of the old regime. And so putting these people to death is then part of this cleansing ritual.
Well,
Political violence is kind of
yeah,
sacred in a way.
yeah. This again gets to Christian ideas of defects of the soul. That you're not a true believer. There's an inquisitorial strain there, but I want to talk a little bit about Rousseau, but by way of the European thought tradition in regard to the New World, because you raise an interesting point. Because we think of the colonial enterprise in places like North America as emerging from this supremacist Christian colonizing um, missionary project, which in many ways it was.
Sure.
However, once the Europeans did encounter what we now call indigenous peoples in places like North America, many of them came away with a very romantic Christian idea that somehow, even as in some cases they were slaughtering these indigenous people, they were also writing these exalted rhapsodies about how they live in this sort of Edenic
Mm.
society, and Europeans, some became transfixed with the idea of different parts of the planet, including pockets of North America, becoming a way to sort of create a new unspoiled civilization. In some ways, the Massachusetts colony was a Protestant version of that. Um, is that did that eventually affect how Rousseau saw his perfect society, which, as you say, is sounds a lot in some ways like
Mm.
communism?
No, I think that's right. I mean, you could talk about it, the noble savage became
Yeah,
almost a cliche, but even more than that, this vision that, again, they're misinterpreting what they're seeing, but they think they're seeing some version of the Garden of Eden. That is, oh, this is maybe, they don't have our elaborate frippery and clothing. They don't have they thought anyway. They don't have the distinctions of wealth and social status. Again, they're misinterpreting societies that were
Well,
much
I
more
mean, there's a
complex
grain of
than they
truth. I
thought.
mean, but for
Right,
economic reasons, indigenous societies do tend to be there's
right,
a
sure.
flatter wealth distribution for
Right, no, no.
technological.
So,
Yeah.
so there's some real truth in it, even if they're exaggerating. But this then helps to inspire this whole tradition of thinking about lost worlds, about lost Edens. And in Rousseau, it's quite explicit in his discourse on the origin of inequality. Maybe a little less so in the social contract, because that's a little bit more about his ideal republic political community. But the idea is definitely at the root of this, that material wealth and civilization are corrupting. So this is what distinguishes Rousseau. I always found him so interesting compared to the philosophes with whom he was often kind of at swords drawn, daggers drawn.
The Enlightenment philosophe.
Right, the Enlightenment philosophes, his letter to D'Alembert. I don't talk about it in this book, but I've written about it elsewhere. This idea, Voltaire and D'Alembert, and they have this idea about how you can improve and perfect society with manners and with elegant theatrical productions that will teach the
They
arts of
had all
social
sorts of
virtue, and all this
sketches and
stuff.
stuff. This is what's
Right.
interesting is like these were urban planners Monkey who like
Hmm.
in their books they had these drawings of, well, here's where the beer would be produced, and
Right.
here's where people would go for their picnics and their leisure. And um I mean, it really was like kind of a video game sim world in which like the human beings were little people who would like go around this perfect universe. uh
Hmm.
um and at the time it
They
must have
believed
been.
in material progress, but
Yeah.
that civilization would become ever more refined. Whereas Rousseau, in many ways, again, was a much truer Christian. I mean, even if he was a little odd in some ways, and saying, "Well, no, actually, material civilization is corrupting. It's
Mm.
corrupting of our inner souls." And he wasn't willing to take this to the final conclusion in the way that later Marx was. I mean, morally, I talk about this much lesser known, but in some ways more interesting figure in the history of communism, because he took it almost to its logical conclusion that, look, if material civilization and inequality is corrupting, then we should do away with it entirely. Rousseau
Mm.
was more just criticizing where it came from, but we can't really get rid of private property. But right, the philosophes, the kind of the optimism and the rationalism of the philosophes, the Enlightenment philosophers, particularly in France, I think they had lost not just a certain element in the Christian tradition that was powerful, but they had also lost some of the tragic sense of life. Rousseau, part of what made him so, I think, enrapturing and so important in the French Revolution was that there was a darker strain there.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
Which
frankly,
you bring it
it
out in your
appeals
book.
to
Yeah.
people, right? That's
Yeah.
part of what appeals to people is, after all, if you're thinking about a justice for sinners or oppressors or the rich and all of this, you want bad things to happen to them, and this is
Mm.
where the sunny optimism of the philosophes maybe was kind of psychologically less potent than the critiques of people like Rousseau. Definitely had a point. I mean, material civilization does lead to inequality, and it does lead to a lot of unhappiness and frustration and variation and inequality between people. He wasn't wrong about that.
So one, I'm not a historian, but one theory I've always had about the emergence of communism is that feudalism, as backward and awful as we now see it, it was a backwardness and an inequitable type of organizing society that at least had a kind of intimacy to it, which
Mm,
is the sense that you knew who the local lord was. You might have some kind of personal relationship with him, even though it was like totally unequal. The local nobles often were rooted in the landscape, and so when you paid him his tax to use his cornmeal or whatnot, there was at least a kind of humanizing exchange. I mean, some of them were
mm,
tyrants, but people had to get along with each other because it was a locally rooted agrarian economy. But then once these people became absentee landowners and started making their money in industry and the city, and it was just anonymous apparatchiks who would come and collect their taxes, it had a profoundly alienating effect on people. And society had always been inequitable, but now it was socially sterile as well, because capitalism,
mm,
for all the riches it gives us, is a socially sterile way of life, in the sense that it's completely atomized. You're often dealing with strangers. And it was that kind of ennui, this deracinated economic model that made people rebel against it.
Yeah.
To what extent is communism a rebellion against the alienation that comes with capitalism and the anonymity of free market transactions?
Well, you can certainly see that in Marx. You can see it right in the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And what's interesting is if you read certain passages of the manifesto, they sound not dissimilar to Edmund Burke
Mm.
in Reflections of the Revolution in France. One of the most famously, some people consider it the founding text of
He's a
modern
real conservative.
conservatism,
Yeah, he's
right?
a real conservative. Yeah,
He's a real conservative. That is to say, he sees capitalism and progress as to some extent also dehumanizing.
which it is.
There's a
Yeah.
famous line about the decent drapery of life being torn off. He talks a lot about the egotistical calculation. The age of chivalry is dead, and all this other stuff he's talking about. It's quite similar to what Marx is saying in the manifesto when Marx is rattling on about. He talks about the bourgeois claptrap of the family, and you can read that on the one hand of, oh, they're going to destroy the family, and to some extent they did. I mean, with orphanages and things like that under communism, but he wasn't saying that we destroyed it, we communists. He was saying the capitalists had already destroyed it. So it was kind of this grotesque thing for them to complain about communism when it was the capitalists who had already destroyed all these human relationships, and the family was no longer sacred because of child labor and all these other practices.
There's a grain of
And
truth
so
to
again,
all
this
of
is
this.
part
Yeah.
of why it resonates,
Yeah.
because there's something real there that he's talking about. His own solution for it turns out to be probably, if anything, even more alienating. You're going to get these industrial armies in the countryside, and the abolition of private property, the state plan. Maybe he didn't understand that he was promising a kind of a hyper planned version of the worst elements of
But at the
capitalism.
very least, in his utopian conceit, it would restore the brotherhood of common
Right.
purpose that capitalism had stripped away.
Right. The alienation of man from his labor. That
Yeah,
is, that
yeah.
whatever it is that you work to produce, you no longer got to enjoy.
Like when people talk about what a historical shock it was that communism succeeded in Russia, which at the time was this non-advanced peasant economy, it was completely
Mm,
contradicted Marx's idea that it'd be the more advanced economies that would progress, as he saw it, to communism. Although seen in historical context, it kind of made sense to me because the idea of a serf village in the early 19th century was a kind of communist commune in the sense that
mm,
it was impossible to survive unless you made common use of fields and people borrowed each other's horses, and the government was kind of this very remote presence which had very little to do with day-to-day life in this village where you know if your ox was dead and you needed to borrow somebody else's, there really
mm.
was a kind of uh, esprit de corps at the village level which the communists kind of said they would replicate. So who doesn't want that deal, right?
Well, right. I mean, had they just been thinking of how can we exploit the peculiarities of the Russian tradition and actually help make people's lives better, then yes, they could have absolutely
Which
drawn
is
a
kind of what the anarchists wanted to do.
right. The different, and I think this is maybe the paradox of Marx is that there's a powerful critique of capitalism, but in the end, Marx, like Lenin, like later Stalin, was also in awe of capitalism. That he saw capitalism as part of his story of progress, and so he didn't want to shy away from it. In fact, the curious aspect of early communism, as far as just policy and how things were actually built and done, is that they kept hiring these Western capitalist
Yeah.
planners, engineers, even agronomists. You had famously the Wheat King of Montana helps to design the collective farm instead of relying on those native Russian traditions and allowing the peasants to arrange things in their own way, which they briefly pretended they were going to do with this decree on the consumption of labor standard in 1917. They instead went in a very radically different direction. And what they did is like, look, we're going to take, in some ways, the most grotesque elements of kind of mega capitalism, these huge blast furnaces and these huge factories, and even a huge, basically a family farm, but just a capitalist operation from Montana, of all places, run by a guy called Thomas Campbell. And we're going to use that as our basis because we want everything to be bigger and better than the capitalists could do it.
Yeah.
In the end, we're going to show that, in fact, the next stage of progress beyond capitalism is going to be this hyper industrialized society that's going to outproduce capitalism. Never actually happened, but this is where I think, again, that although Marx is drawing on the Christian tradition, and even as you're pointing out, some of these critiques of the way capitalism had alienated people from their labor. He doesn't want to go back to feudalism. He doesn't want to go back to the Russian peasant commune. He wants to go forward into the future, so that in the end, this is a little bit how, despite himself, despite his critique of the material progress of capitalism, in the end, he believes in that progress too much. He can't quite shake this idea that, in fact, they want to keep it going and make things better. And here's where he does, I think, distance himself from thinkers like Rousseau, who really did want to put the brakes on to some extent and say, look, we should have smaller communities. We should have more equal social relations. Instead, Marx was in the end just a different variety of a prophet of progress.
Hmm.
So that in that sense, you might say he had a little bit more in common with the philosophers, that he actually did believe in things like capitalist progress. That without the capitalists, we wouldn't have railroads and all the rest of it. They wanted to have railroads too. They just wanted to have bigger and better railroads. They wanted to have steel. They wanted to have metallurgy. They just wanted to
It
have bigger and
became a
better.
sort of industrial supremacist
Right.
creed. One thing that always shocks me when I read histories of Russia is it's just commonly assumed that the communists venerated the peasant, but it's actually not true. In some ways, Stalin in particular was extremely hostile to what we would call peasants because he saw them as backward, and as soon as they got a couple of dollars, kopecks or rubles, the first thing they wanted to do is buy their neighbor's farm and
Right.
become a kulak and become a more successful peasant. It was the proletariat who, sort of like the guy with the hammer and the wrench from out of the social realism propaganda, who is the real hero. There's a book that I read. I actually have it in front of me, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution by Stephen
Mhm.
Cohen,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
which is it's very pro Bukharin, who's a figure who really should be better known than he is. And Bukharin, Mikhail Bukharin, ultimately tragic story, was purged by Stalin. He kind of is a Rubashov figure from Darkness at Noon, like that kind of like a hero of the revolution, great ideologue, greater than Lenin at one point, arguably, and then was purged. But he was the guy who was saying, or at least cautioning, in Politburo meetings, like we can't keep demonizing kulaks and
Mhm.
peasants, and like this can't just be a revolution of factory workers. And in that book, which, as I understand, in historical circles, was quite influential at the time. It's 50 or 60 years old
Mhm.
now. Um, Bukharin is presented in a kind of what if way, like what if his slightly more humane approach, which would not have led, had he been in charge, to the collectivization of farms, which really was in some ways the foundational horror of Stalin era policies. Um, because those who opposed the collectivization often were sent off to the gulags, and it had a knock-on effect in terms of the horrors of communism. Is it realistic to imagine that a more humane version of Soviet communism might have taken root had Stalin not taken control of the party apparatus in the aftermath of Lenin's rule?
Well, it's an interesting question, and you're right that the book was important. It wasn't just influential in Western academia; it was actually specially translated into Chinese, and it was kind of part of the theoretical architecture of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the 1980s. It was adopted as something of a model. That is not just Bukharin's work, his own work, but actually Stephen Cohen's biography of Bukharin was actually
Which
translated
kind
into
of like
by the
shows
Chinese
Bukharin in
government.
the best light. Like it's a
Right.
little bit of an apologist
Right. And I
biography.
mean, if you spin this back just a little bit, what's interesting is you could see when Mao was trying to ape what you're talking about with the Great Leap Forward and this hypertrophic modernization campaign to create Chinese versions of these industrialized collective farms and the backyard blast furnaces and all these absurdities of the Great Leap Forward. He was actually chided by Khrushchev, who said, "Why didn't you learn from our stupid mistakes?" Um, he plowed ahead anyway. And what was interesting about that is, in a way, what Khrushchev was implying was maybe that Bukharin had a point, even though at the time, of course, he was on Stalin's side. So there's definitely something there. That is that. Yeah, okay, so in Bukharin's vision, I don't think he really knows where it's going to go eventually, but the idea is you have to allow the peasants to have some ability to bring their produce to market. You have to allow he did eventually want the state producers to be superior. I mean, like, you actually read the ideas. What he's basically saying is you should let the state compete. For a while, you have to tolerate private trading and retail, but eventually the state will learn from the private concerns how to do it better. So it's not that he's not a communist. It's just he disagrees about the means to achieve the ends. And it would have been more humane, certainly, had that type of a program been implemented. The problem politically, of course, was that it was a kind of a heresy of communism, because he was basically saying that, look, right now the state doesn't really know best. It doesn't do the best. We will eventually outcompete the capitalists, but we have to actually let the capitalists have a fair shake. We have to let the traders have a fair shake. And that's just temperamentally speaking. We talked about eschatology earlier. We talked about the
Yeah.
messianism of the movement. That's a tough sell. Stalin was willing to tolerate it for a while because politically it helped him to sideline certain rivals like Trotsky and Kamenev and Zinoviev and so on. But eventually, I think it wasn't politically viable in a communist system. In the end, sure, you could give up on single party government. You could give up on
It
the
didn't work
idea.
well as a slogan. It didn't.
No, it didn't work well as a slogan. It's kind of. I mean, Lenin was torn up about this himself. I mean, the quotes I unearthed, some great books on the new economic policy of the 1920s. Lenin never made up his mind. How long would it take? Basically, giving up on communism, which they did in 1921 and 1922, when they had to re-legalize. That's what Bukharin was kind of capitalizing on. They'd re-legalized a lot of private retail trade, grain trade, small scale manufacturing, even kind of private restaurants in the service sector. Almost all of that had basically been returned to some variety of free capitalism. And Lenin at times would say, we might need a decade or more. It might be reckoned in decades. He wasn't sure how long it would take. So Bukharin could cite Lenin as kind of scripture and say, well, look, he said we needed at least 10 years or something like that. But, the problem was in the end, that would have taken a modesty and a patience and a tolerance
Right.
for dissent, and even for, frankly, being kind of embarrassed by the fact that these private traders were running rings around it. So you're certainly some Bukharin-esque approach would have been more humane. In the end, Stalin, it wasn't just collectivization of agriculture. They literally just they arrested the net men, that is, these private traders in business. They
Yeah.
arrested nearly 2.7 or 2.8 million of them in 1928 and
And
1929.
and
And
then the
that's what
netmen.
really kicked off high Stalinism, was just the mass arrest. That's how the Gulag was created. They took these private traders and they sent them to forced labor camps.
Yeah, and these netmen, if I remember correctly, they would go to the city and find items that people in the country needed, and
Mhm.
they would sell them at a profit and go back and forth. And they were essentially like kind of street peddlers, but they made the economy work
Yeah,
because
they were greasing the wheels of the economy. They were helping
people.
people to
Yeah,
eat and live.
yeah,
So in the end, that couldn't be tolerated
right.
because you're
Yeah,
showing
sure.
that the government wasn't doing these things, right? The government was not providing the things people needed to live and thrive and so on. And but it wanted to be able to replace them, and so Stalin did away with it.
Yeah, their success was an embarrassment to some extent.
Mhm.
So another historian we've had on this podcast, Orlando Figes, who is a beautiful writer about Russian history,
Mhm.
and in our discussion and in his book, he talks about how he's more concerned with analyzing the pathologies of the Russian political character, and he traces it in part. I'm compressing a very complex thesis here, but he traces it in part to, hold on to your seats, folks, the the Byzantine Christian tradition, which
Mhm.
was essentially co-opted by the Russians, which had a much easier time compressing political and spiritual power.
Mhm.
And whereas in the West, it was more, separation of church and state became a thing that had much less traction in the East, in the Orthodox Christian tradition, and that to a certain extent in communism and now under Putinism, um, you have this you can call it the co-option of the church, but really it kind of goes back to the czarist idea of the czar as a political and spiritual kind of godhead figure who controls the lives of his grateful and ignorant subjects. And
Mhm.
that tradition kind of spans Christianity and communism and Tsarism and Putinism. It's kind of like this constant. How much of that do you think? And again, I'm getting to what Figes describes as, call it, the peculiarities of the Russian historical character. How much of
Mhm.
that is tied in with the emergence of the Soviet Union as the leading champion of Marxism?
Yeah, well, Feige is very interesting on these questions. I also highly recommend his book on Crimea, by the way, and the Crimean War. It's
Sure.
really excellent. I have a Russian friend, actually, and this is not necessarily to knock Feiges. I'm channeling a friend who is still a bit angry about A People's Tragedy. That was Feiges, his big popular history of the Russian Revolution. Not about the whole book, but about a section title in the late Tsarist period. And I think the section title, or maybe it was just a label, which is, I think, channeling an old Trotsky quote, icons and cockroaches. So, anyway, this Russian kind of, a proud Russian, shall we say, did not like this disparagement of the backwardness of Tsarist Russia. But that said, there's something to be said for continuity. There was a famous argument between Richard Pipes and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn had been invited after he had, as the Soviet dissident author of Gulag Archipelago, he had been invited to give the commencement address at Harvard in, I think, 1978 or 79. It was the late 70s. And a lot of people were expecting him to be grateful for the freedom that he was given and the fact he was living in this beautiful house in Vermont. And I think his son grew up a Boston Red Sox fan, somewhat Americanized.
That's too bad.
He was not Americanized himself. Instead he launched into this kind of somewhat ferocious critique of Western decadence, dating all the way back to the era of the Renaissance, and that we'd all take. He was basically drawing on the Russian Orthodox tradition and saying, in fact,
Awkward,
we all took a wrong
awkward
turn.
moment.
Even
Yeah.
the Catholics were wrong, the Protestants were wrong. This kind of Western materialism is wrong. That we had all taken this unchristian path. I know that was maybe a bit extreme, although there are elements of this you can see in the later writings of Tolstoy. There's this old, somewhat almost messianic vision in one of Tolstoy's last works. He actually he launched into this tirade against Shakespeare for giving
Oh
people.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, very,
Yeah.
very, very curious.
By the
But
way, just for
there are
those,
obviously
if I could,
peculiarities of the Russian Orthodox tradition we're dealing with here. I could see, and anyway, the point I was going to make about Pipes was Pipes, and again, one can believe this or not depending on taste, but apparently there was a dinner party shortly after, around the time of this speech, when Pipes, the thing that he found a little off-putting about Solzhenitsyn's viewpoint was that Solzhenitsyn was trying to say that Marxism, that is to say communism, Marxism, was a Western import that had nothing to do with the Russian tradition. And I used to hear this from a lot of Russians when I spent a lot more time in Russia back in the 90s and the aughts. This idea that, I mean, look, there are extreme versions of this, kind of
by the
like
way, just
Trotsky.
10
Trotsky was
second
thinking by Wall Street,
intervention. I mean, it didn't
yeah,
help that Lenin was literally sent, I guess,
right.
to Finland Station in a sealed rail car by the
That's right.
Germans.
Sent there by Germany.
Yeah.
So Marx was German, or sort of a subject of Prussia. Lenin was sent there by Germany. So it's this foreign import that's completely alien to the Russian character. Pipes's counter argument to Solzhenitsyn was, look, do you really think that this one important moment, 2 a.m. on November 7th, our calendar, of course, it's an October old calendar, 1917, that one society was completely overturned, and then what
Yeah.
happened later had nothing to do with what happened before. And what is curious about it is, I mean, you can definitely see in the autocratic nature of Tsarism, you can see antecedents of what you would see with obviously the autocracy under Lenin, later Stalin. Even some of the liturgy, the symbolism, they obviously borrowed some of this from Russian culture. You could see versions of icons and all of the
Oh,
kind of
this goes back
statues.
to Constantinople. I mean,
Right.
this
I mean,
theory.
going
Yeah.
back to the Third Rome idea about
Yeah.
Russia, this kind of messianism, icons. This is where, okay, I'm going to leave aside the cockroaches, but the idea of the icons,
Yeah.
there's something to this, right? Every Russian sort of peasant would have, their icon by the mantelpiece, and Russians were obviously expected to have these kinds of, busts or depictions of Lenin, Stalin. Obviously, there's a lot there as far as continuity and drawing on older traditions. In many ways, of course, though, they upended things. They tried to eradicate the church, even if they didn't wholly succeed. There, I think people like Figes and Solzhenitsyn also have a point about the fact that the Orthodox Church was always much more connected, sometimes controlled, sometimes organically connected to Russian state institutions. Even Peter the Great, for example, briefly abolished the patriarchate to bring the church more firmly into the control of the czarist government. Certainly in the era of Soviet communism, although the church still existed and Stalin even rehabilitated it to some extent in the Second World War, there was definitely a kind of penetration of the church by the security organs, for lack of a better word. And Putin, I mean, this is a slightly different subject. I mean, the way I view things is obviously there are elements of commonality. I mean, I've written about Putin before, and I've pointed out that even when it comes to things like authoritarian governance and censorship, in some ways, Putin's government is actually, I think, more aggressive as far as repression, censorship than the Tsarist government was. On the other hand, it was a lot less than the Soviet government was. That is to say, there's continuity, but there's also degree. And I think that the Soviet government, in almost every way, took these elements in the Russian tradition in a kind of even more extreme direction. That is to say, a more extreme autocracy, a more extreme eradication of kind of private freedoms and private society and all the rest of it. So they're common elements, but I wouldn't want to overdo the point. I wouldn't want to overegg the pudding because some of what you saw under Soviet communism grew out of Marx and Marx's ideas. That is, those Russians just say it was totally foreign. I mean, obviously, I think the truth is somewhere in between. A lot of these ideas might have come from abroad, but they were then grafted onto these Russian traditions, and the ultimate result, unfortunately, combines some of the worst aspects of
Yeah.
Marxist thought and the Russian authoritarian tradition.
The export of communism to East Asia is particularly strange to my mind because, well, let's go back a little. Like, Lenin and his successors had this very surreal philosophical project they had to confront, which is that the path of history had completely contradicted Marxist prophecies. Um, the Western powers were not crumbling, capitalism was not dying, the German Socialist Revolution had died out. Uh, the first communist country was nowhere near where Marx had predicted, and they were still like kind of clinging to the conceit that Marx had foreseen everything, even though the path of 20th century history showed that he'd foreseen nothing. But they were still trying to extrapolate his principles to answer questions like, well, should we trade grain with the West? And
Mm,
even though, especially in the area of international relations, Marx was like really in la la land when it came to his predictions. As you said, he was a great critic of capitalism, but a terrible prophet of what might come after it. When it comes to exporting communism to East Asia, things get particularly weird because Marx's writings about East Asia are like almost non-existent, and to the extent
mm,
he talked about East Asia, it's what Edward Said would have called sort of like Orientalism. Like it was kind of, well, these are kind of like mystics who have kind of Puba driven societies, and it's like he'd never visited these places and had no real idea of how they operated, even less than his ignorance of Russia, which is not where he would have predicted the first communist society would have been. How did East Asian, Chinese society in particular, become enamored with these ideas that really were rooted in the industrial heartland of Germany? And, Marx's
mm,
observations of the Paris Commune and the War of 1870, and like really a Western European philosophy that was
mm.
marginally applicable to Russia, but didn't seem at all applicable to
Yeah.
the
Well,
traditions
let's
of
start
East
with
Asia.
Marx. You're right. Marx didn't take any great interest in Asia, certainly not particularly in China. Curiously enough, though, in his late years, he did actually become a little bit obsessed with Russia. And there's an interesting line there where, again, you're right about these ideas of kind of you've got the center of Europe and you've got capitalism and all the rest of it. But there's an element in Marx's thought, which I do try to emphasize in the book, that in a sense, he's also this news junkie when it comes to what he considers world historical events and developments. So that it's not just about the development of capitalism and the alienation of people from labor, but it's also about the big headlines about wars, things like the Franco-Prussian War, or later, a little bit later in his life, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, which he became almost obsessed with. And the way in which he would graft his ideas about dialectical materialism, as it was called, this idea of, again, class struggle and history being propelled
It's like a
forward in this kind of connected way.
Hegelian idea. Yeah.
Right, this Hegelian kind of dynamic at the heart of history was that in any war, I mean, he was fascinated by wars in part because inherently one side in every war would be either more advanced or less advanced than the other. And so to some extent, wars would move history forward. Now, it wasn't always necessarily material advancement. It might have been more in the realm of politics, so that his view of the Franco-Prussian War was that because France had become authoritarian under Napoleon III, he wanted France to lose and get a good thrashing, as he put it. In the case of Russia, Russia to Marx had really become just the hotbed of reaction of all kinds. So anyone opposed to Russia would have basically excited Marx's support. And in fact, curiously enough, one of his last kind of political writings, he actually heaped praise on Winston Churchill's father, and the British Tories for standing up to Russia. This element of Russophobia, which traces all the way back to the 1850s. And some of Marx's friends and acquaintances in England were part of this very British tradition of Russophobia that was common in the 19th century. And so the idea he had become almost obsessed with Russia, again, not because it was at the vanguard of capitalism or anything, but rather as a hotbed of reaction should excite the interest of revolutionaries because of the possibility of toppling that government. Now, China didn't really factor into Marx's thinking. It definitely factored into the thinking of Lenin and later Stalin. This is in part because when they create the new Communist International in 1919, which in the Marxist parlance was the Third International, they're really just looking for opportunities anywhere, ideally in neighbors, in part because they could seed those places with funds, with activists they were supporting, even with arms in some cases. And so you saw
Union
an
movement
effort to
through the
support the
union movement.
revolution.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, to Bavaria, to Hungary. China then just becomes an opportunity, it becomes a great opportunity in the 30s and 40s because, of course, it becomes a battleground, basically,
Yeah.
with Japanese forces in Manchuria, Manchukuo, eventually in the Chinese mainland, eventually Soviet armies on the march in the east, as I discussed in the book. So that it gets exported to China by way of war. This is where, again, you can see that Marxism, like Marxist Leninism, sure, there are these economic elements to the thinking, but also this notion, and Lenin himself outlined this in a little-known text called The Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution back in 1916. He, a little bit like Rosa Luxemburg, who had first started talking about not just imperialism, but also the struggle between the great powers as being something Marxists should be interested in. Basically, war was something they should be interested in. And Lenin, first in a work called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and then in the Military Program of the Proletarian Revolution, actually outlined something of an updating of Marxist theory, that maybe it wasn't capitalist competition that would produce the final cataclysm as far as industrial progress and the centralization of all of the means of production in ever fewer hands, is what Marx had hinted in Das Kapital. Rather, what seemed to be happening as they're reading the story of the First World War is that the capitalist imperialist powers were destroying each other in these kind of civil wars inside the capitalist world, and that the communists could use that to march to power in their ruins, not least because they were foolishly arming the proletarian masses. That is to say, the people drafted into these armies of millions could be propagandized, proselytized to become at least sympathizers with communism, with Marxist ideas, eventually with, of course, Marxism, Leninism after the Soviets were in power. And in Lenin's vision, which he actually outlines rather exuberantly, this is going to produce a whole age of war. You're going to get first the wars between the capitalist countries, which will help to midwife the first communist regime as the imperialist war turns into a civil war. And then you're going to have one communist country here, and you're going to have other countries still capitalist that are effectively at war with communism because they can't be at peace because they're
Right.
diametrically opposed. And then eventually more countries will be communists. And like the more you get in your column, the better armed you'll be for the final struggle, the final cataclysm. And so this is part of, I think, an evolution of Marxist theory under Soviet communism, but
Yeah.
particularly first Lenin. And then Stalin might not have been as impressive a theorist as Lenin, but in practice, he was very good at this game. That is helping to export and spread the revolution
But
in places like China.
one problem is that from a Marxist perspective, if history doesn't unfold as you foretell, there's no coherent basis for foreign policy
Mm,
that emerges from Marxist thought, because the idea of like managing trade contracts and
right.
like there's there's nothing from the absolutist rhetoric of Marxism that will prepare like the foreign minister of a communist country to, how to how do you deal with the real world. I want to just go back to the Franco-Prussian War, or I think the War of 1870, one of these wars that has different names depending on whether your side won or lost, um, which always struck me as an understudied war. I recently reviewed Rachel Crastal's new book about that war.
Mm-hmm.
And I was shocked about my own ignorance about just how many technological innovations in warfare had come out of it. And it would have been the defining conflict for, in Marx's era. That would have been the world war. That would have been the great conflict of nations, the great crucible of ideas, where the Germans really had demonstrated technological superiority in terms of, the way they used trains and the way they
Yeah.
equipped their army. And then, of course, the Paris Commune that came out of it, which the emergence of the Paris Commune, like to Marx, this whole thing was this a microcosm of what was the rest of the world was? You had these two capitalist states going to war. The more advanced state won, and out of it, history was pushed forward. Marx actually, I don't know if he wrote a whole book about the Paris Commune, but he had extremely vigorously argued ideas about what went wrong there, right?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a speech that was later made into part of the canon of Marx's writings, Civil War in Bürgerkrieg in Frankreich, Civil War in France. Originally a speech, he's reacting to events on the ground. You can actually see in the full body of his writing some correspondence during the war, the way he's thinking about it. And on the one hand, you might say there's a certain element of opportunism or cynicism
But
in
he
that he
thought that might be the 1917 moment. I mean, what we would now call the
well,
1917
yeah, at
moment.
least in
Yeah,
France. That is to
yeah,
say, the reason he wanted France to lose was so
right.
that there would be a political revolution in France. You can definitely see the seeds of later's Lenin idea about revolutionary defeatism. Basically, you want your side to lose in a war right there. But the way Marx is responding to this is that not just because of the cataclysm and the clash of arms, but also because France had always been kind of a vanguard country, but which had fallen to reaction. That because that government was so kind of odious and reactionary, a war in which that government was discredited and lost would then lead to a great social revolution. And it actually did happen in the form
Yeah,
of
it did
the
happen. Yeah.
Paris Commune. And of course, the Paris Commune was not, this is one of those exchanges I've sometimes had with critics. I remember even once I gave a job talk and at Wesleyan, and someone in the audience who was kind of a Marxist himself was trying to make this point about how little supposedly in 20th century regimes resembled true Marxism. The idea of like this wasn't true communism, this wasn't what Marx said. Well, in Marx's own lifetime, the closest that anyone got was the Paris Commune, and
Mm.
sure, they did not nationalize the means of production, and maybe they didn't have the outright abolition of private property. There were certain populist economic measures, redistribution, a certain level of kind of the state trying to take a much bigger role in social and economic life, obviously on behalf of the artisans and the poor. So there were some elements that at least they might have smelled a little bit like communism, even if they weren't exactly the formula laid out in the Communist Manifesto. And some people were thinking that because some people were even blaming Marx for this and his ideas and his so-called First Working Man's International Association, even though it didn't really play a decisive role
Which
in the
is such a
event.
great name. It sounds like a YMCA or something like that.
Yeah, it was the
Yeah,
first Working Men's
yeah,
International Association. And a lot of people want, some of the people who had supported the organization in England in particular wanted Marx to distance himself from this, saying like, look, first of all, this thing is it's doomed to be crushed eventually. It's not true Marxism anyway. It's not true to our ideas. And there were already rumors they'd taken hostages and the whole thing was kind of going to become violent or was already violent. And Marx went the other way. He fully embraced it,
sure.
endorsed it in root and branch,
Yeah.
from soup to nuts. The whole thing was fantastic. Even when people started saying like, "Oh, but why did they send women and children out into battle to be slaughtered?" And why they're burning down government buildings? They're torching places. They're taking hostages and executing them. And Marx said, "Absolutely, that's exactly what we
Yeah.
need.
Super. Yeah.
We absolutely
Right.
this is the way the revolution happens." And the closest approximation in the lifetime. Marx couldn't get enough of it. It's true he didn't actually go there. Some people criticized him like Bakunin because he was something of a I don't know physical coward at the very
He
least. He
was
was
in
never
London the
really
whole
there
time. He
himself.
was.
But
Yeah.
yeah, he was in London the whole time. But he absolutely embraced the violence. And this is where you can definitely see where Marx and later Lenin and the others they are different from those who were maybe just socialists in spirit who liked
Yeah.
equality. He absolutely wanted there to be cleansing violence and you had to put the class enemies to death and all the rest of it. So war was a huge part of it, and I think Marx realized you wouldn't have gotten this without the war. And so that's why Lenin and later Stalin were able to figure out on the fly that actually the way to advance communism was by helping to kind of promote, spread, deepen, exacerbate, etc., conflict around the world.
Yeah.
That was the only real way you could come to power, through violence.
Communism emerges from civil war,
Yeah.
which China, Russia, these examples show. Um,
Yeah, civil war to most people is a horror. To
right.
Marxists and communists, civil war is essential.
It's an opportunity. Yeah.
It's an opportunity, right?
Uh, my most recent podcast guest was Paul Berman,
Mm.
who author of many great books, including Terror and Liberalism. And we talked a little bit about the legacy of Frantz Fanon uh, and his book, The Wretched of the Earth. And he was a what we now call post-colonial theorist who um, I don't want to generalize too much because his writing is more nuanced than is sometimes portrayed, but there's certainly a strain of romanticizing violence and
Mm.
violence as a cleansing solution to the evils of society and sort of overturning society. And this does go to an animal reflex in the human brain when we see injustice or when we become disgusted with a political system where we cheer on sometimes nihilistic violence because we just want to get rid of it. And that's maybe not an ideological impulse as much as it is a kind of like violent human tendency that gets awakened and put into the language of political manifestos. Is there something of that in Marx? Because as you say, like he was somebody who didn't experience political violence personally, didn't get involved, but was kind of like one of these armchair cheerleaders
Yeah.
for mass murder. Like that, there is a kind of very unattractive tendency in that respect.
Well, to us, it's unattractive. I think to most ordinary people, it's unattractive. But we shouldn't delude ourselves. There are many people to whom that appeals.
Does that come out of the anarchist tradition, the propaganda of the deed, so to speak?
Well, the anarchists, it's not that they obviously didn't shy away from violence. It would be a little bit more targeted, right? So they might assassinate
Czars,
obviously
yeah.
head of state, in many cases, or a tsar, or even kind of the head of a factory, or a particular person who seemed to be oppressing the workers or mistreating the workers. Every so often, they would actually assassinate someone by accident, kind of on false recognizance. But they're not killing everybody. It's more the deed was supposed to be a symbolic act that would, I guess, somehow liberate people, or at the very least allow them to have some relief from their oppression. And so it's not that the anarchists shied away from violence, but they definitely didn't have this vision of this kind of all-encompassing mass cleansing violence that the Marxists did.
Yeah.
And the Marxists, it was maybe counterproductive just to have random acts of terror. Rather, you had to have masses of the proletarians, supposedly, but again, later on, just the soldiers on the battlefield, that you gave millions of them, in some cases thousands, in some cases millions, arms, and they would then basically use those to seize power and terrorize class enemies. But it had to be organized.
Mm.
Eventually, you actually had to create institutions to help
Well, they
rationalize the
were
violence.
deeply suspicious of autonomous, like village level freelancers going off on their own to promote social justice.
Right. Oh, that's absolutely true. Right. It had to be organized in the end by the party and by the state. But to back to that idea where you're talking about Fanon or someone else in the romanticization of violence. I mean, you could definitely see. I mean, to some extent, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, as
Mm.
far as where they were educated, they're coming out of a pretty similar milieu of revolutionary thought in Paris. Some of which, again, went back to the French tradition, and we shouldn't undercut the appeal of this, even in just the regular French revolutionary tradition. The idea was, I mean, you look at the French Revolution, and what do you have with these acts of seeming cleansing violence? They assault the Bastille, even though it turns out to be mostly empty of political prisoners, and the governor even tries to negotiate with him, and they end up cutting off his head anyway, and
Which they still
parading.
celebrate to this day, which is
Yeah, I mean, they celebrate it. It's the
it's
national holiday in France.
super weird. Given that there are things to celebrate in the French Revolution, though
Yeah.
that isn't one of them. Um, Before we wrap up, uh, like covering the history of communism in a book is an ambitious enterprise. Covering it in an hour and a half podcast interview is even more ambitious. But the strange non-death of communism is the title of one of your latter chapters. What does that mean? The strange non-death of communism.
Well, I should say first of all that I hope we haven't covered the whole book in our talk, because I do hope that people will go out and buy it and
Oh no,
try
no,
to
this
read
is not. I don't want to represent this as a
it. Right.
replacement for
Yeah,
reading your
of
book,
course, of
which
course.
you know
Um,
is not an
yeah,
not an insubstantial book as you might imagine given the subject.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question about the strange non-death of communism. I mean, there's a kind of very simple, literal answer, which is that, of course, after Tiananmen Square, the communists stayed in power in China, and you still have communist regimes in places like North Korea and Vietnam and Laos, and to a slightly lesser extent in Cambodia and Cuba, but where the party basically still rules. So regimes still exist. The idea still exists. In some ways, it's lost, I think, some of the taboo that maybe um, was associated with it for a while in the 90s and the early aughts. I cite this rather shorter history of communism that Richard Pipes wrote about 25 years ago, 23 maybe years ago, where he said he was writing the obituary of communism. And that's
Mm.
kind of what I'm channeling, or I suppose riffing off of the idea that, oh, well, goodbye to all that. Thank goodness that's over and we don't have to deal with it anymore. So that's just the simple part of the answer. I think the more subtle part of the answer is that, sure, you don't really have fellow travelers in the way you did in the 20s and 30s.
You see a
China
few. You
has,
see here in
there are a
Canada,
few, there's
and
some, and
they
even in the United States, I mean, the Communist Party still exists. It still has
they tend
like
to be,
20,000 members or something,
but
right?
here in Canada, where I'm speaking to you from, they tend to be extremely young, people with
Yeah,
no historical memory
right.
of
They don't know the
yeah,
history, right?
uh, or sometimes they're extremely old. They're people who just kind of like old veterans of the mid Cold War Union movement who just sort of like became fossils. Uh,
Right.
it's rare that you find like a 40-year-old communist who isn't a university professor.
Yeah. I mean, Trotskyists, I think you saw more of, 20, 30, 40, 50 years
Hmm.
ago than you probably do now. But so in that sense, I'm not saying that communism is necessarily in the same position it was in 1935 or 1947 or something like that. But here's the other thing about communism. People often ask me in these conversations to come up with a kind of precise dictionary definition of communism, something maybe about the means of production. The thing is, the meaning has changed over time. I mean, as a historian, this is just one of my big themes. In the same way that Marx's ideas, some of them stayed the same, some of them evolved. Lenin, I talked about updating the ideas. I think communism is something different today. It both means something different, and there are different elements about it that are both, I think, striking and interesting, but also potentially worrying. I talk about the COVID lockdowns, and maybe people have different opinions on that. But the part about it that is the most obviously communist in inspiration is that, well, some of the people who helped to organize them actually said that they were importing ideas from communist China. Neil Ferguson, not the Scottish British historian at the Hoover Institution, but the epidemiologist Neil Ferguson. He was the one who came up with these kind of models, with hundreds of thousands of death that helped to justify
Right. So
the more
pro-lockdown.
extreme
He's
early
pro-lockdown.
measures, right?
Yeah.
But at one point, he actually said, "Well, look, we didn't think we could get away with lockdown in Western countries because it was a communist policy from China, and then we tried it in Italy, and we realized we could."
This guy's
And then they
terrible
did
at
it.
marketing. Like if
Yeah,
I were,
this guy, he said the quiet part out loud.
yeah,
He
no,
wasn't supposed to
why
say
would
that.
you say that?
Why would you say that? Right. But so, okay, maybe quarantine. Hopefully, we won't have to deal with forcible quarantine of healthy people in their homes again. But, the more the ideas about kind of the social credit and stricter control of the media and censorship. I've sometimes been asked, could Soviet communism had endured with maybe slightly more supple or clever policies? I mean, I think had the KGB had at their disposal the tools that any modern Western government now has, as far as learning what the private
Yeah,
thoughts of people are, as far as we just put it out there and it's right there for them. They had to actually go out and sort of spy and beat it out of people,
yeah.
to try to, lock down the dissidents. These forms of social control, and fortunately, most governments don't use all the tools at their disposal. But, the slightly, I think, worrying thing now is that the tools are actually there if governments want to use them, in the way that you had a social credit system under common, just in the obvious sense. You had to join the party, you had to do all these
Oh,
things in
to
order to
advance.
advance
Yeah.
society, right? It's subtler now, obviously, because the party line might change from day to day. Well, it's sometimes changed under communism too. But the tools there, in some ways, are even more powerful than those that the communists used to have. And so, in that way, I guess I'm talking more about the residue of communist practice than I am about people actually joining the
Yeah. Although
communist.
in North Korea, It isn't quite residue. I mean, North
No,
Korea,
you're right. It's not
yeah.
residue
Yeah.
there. And the other thing that we shouldn't forget is you say, oh, well, there are only 20,000 members of the Communist Party of the United States or something. Well, there weren't that many more communists in
Oh,
Russia
when
in
the Bolsheviks
1917.
when the Bolsheviks waltzed
Yeah,
into the White Palace, I mean, Kerensky's regime had been so discredited that it was kind of like the first tiny group with any kind of coherent
right.
platform was just here. You give it a
Yeah,
try. I mean, it doesn't in the midst of war and chaos, which thankfully we don't have in the West right now,
right,
on a gigantic totalizing scale. Ukraine being an exception, we don't have those conditions that allow
right,
radicals to just take over. But certainly, the 1917 example shows that it doesn't take a large group of people.
right.
Um, the COVID example is interesting and maybe one to end on because, uh, like my views on COVID lockdown are fairly conventional. I think at the time it was justified to take fairly rigorous public health measures and curtail some civil liberties. I sort of I don't have a problem with governments doing that, but the way governments did that, at least in places like Canada, was sort of like, well, we have to make a call it a Hegelian compromise between civil liberties and public health. And there's a lot of people who are very angry about the compromise that was made,
Mhm.
but there was I believe a compromise made, and broadly speaking, I kind of agree with it. To some extent, that sort of happened in the West more generally with like, well, we're not going to become communists, but we're going to allow greater rights for labor unions. We're not going to permit child labor. We're going to create a welfare state to share the riches. We're going to have capital gains taxes.
Progressive
And
income tax, right?
yeah, which in a
Yeah.
way is what the communists feared. Like they were completely hostile to that because they realized that this was going to undercut their program. uh, like the best way to forestall a revolution is to give people the kind of popular things that the revolutionaries want without giving them control of government. Is that ultimately what doomed communism in the West, which is just the welfare state and taking on, maybe without saying so, some of the critiques of laissez-faire capitalism that Marx
Mhm.
offered without his, to my mind, slightly like bizarre
Mhm.
eschatology about where society was heading? Like, is that ultimately what was the death knell for communism in the West?
Well, yeah, the co-option certainly of certain ideas, or even at times parts of Communist Party platforms that are
Yeah,
actually now law in the West. I mean, again, not the extreme abolition of all private property, but those measures you talked about, or the progressive income tax. A
yeah,
lot of these things have at times actually been advocated for by communists. So, to some extent, sure, there's a little bit of flattery by imitation there, which maybe helps to co-opt the appeal of communism as a political doctrine. But I think in a lot of ways, again, it depends on your perspective. But you could say, for example, that the things that we used to criticize in the West about communist societies, not again the most obvious economic elements about abolition of private property, but more like the surveillance and the
yeah,
censorship and the lack of freedom and all of those different things. In a lot of ways, again, we've imported that too. That is to say, when you talk about things like social media and government agencies, and some of it is done almost on a voluntary basis, or even just the sharing out of private information. Some of it for reasons of commerce, but some of it for reasons of again a variety of a kind of a social credit system. Even with the vaccines, I mean, this is a huge subject, but you had a categorization then of the people who were unvaccinated, who were literally not allowed
right,
to have certain jobs or to travel. I mean, for several years, even there was a famous example with the world's leading tennis player, who couldn't travel to the United States for
yeah.
2 years. These
Djokovic, yeah,
examples where amazingly some of the social controls in these Western countries actually went beyond those that had been traditionally practiced by communist regimes, at least in some areas, obviously not in others. I guess what I mean is that the tools are obviously there if the governments choose to use them. Whether you're talking about Rousseau and putting people outside the political community, or party members alone being allowed to advance, there are all kinds of ways in which Western countries have adopted elements of what we might have once, I think, recognized as communism. But I think you're right that the appeal of this broader notion of like we have to abolish all private property, we have to plan the economy. I don't think Gus Plan is coming back. So I think that
right,
those particular flavors of communism you saw under Stalin and Mao don't really have any broad popular appeal. I think even in China, obviously, while the party still rules and so on, they're obviously not proposing those variants or those flavors of communism. But I think other elements that grew out of the tradition, I think, are kind of still with us. In some cases accidentally, or as you point out, just kind of co-opting ideas in part to limit the appeal of the more extreme, I think, revolutionary radical program.
Sean McMeekin's new book is To Overthrow the World. If you want to read an excerpt from the book, you can go to the Quillette website. Professor McMeekin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jonathan. It was a great pleasure.